a global parliament that can actually enact law in a more complex system. But in a nutshell, that is the idea. And this parliament would be elected by global citizens and would be accountable to them as well.
To many representatives of different countries, to many officials, diplomats, I don't know, governmental persons, what do they say?
My sense is that if we ask the diplomats, they are all agreed that the UN should simply stay as it is.
Okay.
Right? They don't embrace the idea.
No matter which country the diplomat is represented.
Yeah. Our work is structured in 3 program areas, which is promoting global democracy, global governance, and global citizenship. And we are looking at these 3 fields and their intersections from the backdrop of the global crisis.
But first of all, I would like you to tell a few words on what the Democracy Without Borders is, what kind of entity it is, what is, what it was founded for, what it's meant to be.
Yes, Democracy Without Borders is a civil society organization that is working internationally. We have chapters across the world, so we have local activities. And our work is structured in 3 program areas, which is promoting global democracy, global governance, and global citizenship. And we are looking at these 3 fields and their intersections from the backdrop of the global crisis that is imminent today, but that has been going on for decades, actually. And
right, but you mentioned global citizenship, and it's a very interesting construction. What do you mean by that?
Global citizenship for us means that every person on the planet by birth should have specific legal rights and responsibilities in the end.
Okay, and can you, sorry for interrupting, but can you mention probably the main rights and responsibilities? That's the first thing. And the second, don't you think it corresponds to the UN Declaration on Human Rights that tells that everybody is born, for example, free, everybody is granted this and that, and isn't it already existent conception of...
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It is right to refer to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights.
Okay.
As a reference, or let's say the International Covenant on Civic and Political Rights as well. Mm-hmm. So there is already a body of international instruments that are widely recognized that could capture the essence of global citizenship. But of course, today, any of these rights are granted, if they are granted at all, by national governments, right?
Right.
So in democracies, you can expect many of these rights to have been implemented, but in autocracies they don't exist. So in terms of global citizenship, it means that there would have to be a core group of rights that are not at the disposal of nation states, but that they are granted globally by a global body.
But what are these rights? For example, can you mention a few of them, probably?
Well, of course. I mean, first of all, it is that each human being should be treated equally, right? And that there's a respect of an inviolation of life, right?
Right.
So that are very basic matters, or that you should not be subjected to bodily harm. But it also can, go beyond these fundamental rights to more innovative and modern manifestations, such as the right for a healthy environment, which is very important, right?
And who did you say will not provide, but who will maybe protect, or who will be responsible or capable to provide, these global citizenship rights?
Well, in the end, what we are talking about in terms of legally a global citizenship, then of course we need a political body that grants these rights, as you rightfully point out. Yes, and with which this new demos, the global demos, is connected with. And this is, in our opinion, a new United Nations organization, a world federation, if you like, which is, according to our theory of change, the long-term vision that we are striving at. So that would be a system, a democratic system that is based on global citizens. And one of the key political rights then for these global citizens would be to freely and fairly elect their representation at the global scale, in more specifically a global parliament. So a global parliament that can actually enact law in a more complex system, but in a nutshell, that is the idea. And this parliament would be elected by global citizens and would be accountable to them as well.
But what's the problem with already existing bodies such as the United Nations organization? Because it already represents almost like 98% of existing countries and territories in the world. So why do you want to establish something new, as you said, new United Nations organization?
Yes.
Why is it like that?
I mean, the UN in 1945, after the Second World War, was established with the idea, with the founding words, "We the peoples." But essentially, the UN is only an organization of nation states, and more specifically, of the executive branches of nation states. So it is an instrument of the great powers in the Security Council, who have the veto right also in that body, but also of member states in general. And this does not, representation of member states does not equal representation of citizens. And even in democracies, only those who elected the government are actually represented. And minorities and the opposition doesn't exist. It's not,
Yeah. Right, but wait, how are you going to represent these minorities? For example, okay, let's take some country, right? Because you don't avoid that there will be countries still like states.
Oh, yes.
And there are some people who voted for the political party, let's say, that formed the government, and there are like minorities who voted for other parties. How are you going to represent these groups? Because it could be like 7 different types of political minority. There could be other types, let's say ethnic minorities, if you're going to divide this, or like different territories with different electoral preferences, not only electoral preferences, but the preferences for, I don't know, social rights, freedoms, political rights, civil rights, etc. How are you going to represent all these people from all these countries in the entity you are talking about?
Yeah, well, the representation in a global parliament depends on the allocation of seats, first of all. So your question boils down, I believe, to how are the seats going to be, divided across the world.
Not even like how they're going to be divided, but how are you going to represent these people, like all of them, with different interests?
There are, of course, limits. First of all, for a global parliament to be workable, there needs to be an upper limit of members, we believe. Otherwise, it's just going to be too large and not being effective. So we think this upper limit is at around 800 to 1,000 representatives in the global parliament. So we have this number of seats, effectively, that we can deal with. And there are different models that can be applied, for sure. We have not, we have not yet determined the model that we recommend, but we are recommending principles that should be applied at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So first of all, we believe that the idea is best to be understood as a process. It will start at some point, pragmatically, and over time, it will progress more and more into the direction of a democracy that is based on one vote, one person, one vote.
Right.
But at the beginning, first of all, like you rightfully pointed out, we do have the nation states in existence, and the voting could be based on those nation states. So the first big issue that has to be dealt with is that nation states are vastly different. You know, on the one hand, we have small island states like Tuvalu that have 15,000 population, right? At the UN, one state, one vote.
Yes.
And then we have China or India with over 1 billion people, also one state, one vote.
Yeah.
So our principles that we are suggesting to somehow come to a better way of inclusion that also embraces minorities is, first of all, that in each today's nation states, one seat would go to the majority in the parliament, and one seat would go to the official opposition.
Okay.
Right? So, I mean, we have around 130 democracies still and around 60 autocracies. But we still think that this is an approach that can be taken to be as inclusive as possible. And after that, the remaining seats, right, we have around 200 countries. So if we use that principle, 400 seats are already distributed. Then we have around 400 to 600 seats left. And we believe those seats that are left can be distributed according to population size. So it really then depends on
and how
demography.
How to deal with the countries that don't have any opposition, or when the opposition is kind of, fake.
That's right.
So how are you going to deal with these regimes?
So then the process comes into play, because at the beginning it would be a consultative body only, because if obviously, and your question is right, a global parliament that is truly democratic cannot be built on undemocratic nation states, right?
Right.
So it truly, over time, depends on democratization and democratic change, especially in Russia and in China. However, we think it is possible to start now and simply disregard that problem, because those are two large states, but they won't have a majority. Everybody would know who these people are and who they are, representing. That they are not representing the people, but the government, essentially.
But did I get you right? Sorry for interrupting again.
Yes.
Did I get you right that you mean that you expect, or like you somehow see the democratization of Russia or China?
No, not at this moment. It is quite, I think, the contrary.
On long-term perspective?
In the long-term perspective.
What if it happens on the other direction? What if Russia, for example, gets more and more oppressive instead of more and more democratic?
Hopefully not. Then this vision will not work.
Okay, and then I have another question following this about this vision that might not work. Why do you think already existing institutions that are like, of course, that are like interstate institutions, but they provided the world basic rights and freedoms, and I'm not talking about political, but social rights, social and economic rights and freedoms were the invention of the socialists, like socialist countries, like Soviet Union was, very much pushing that human rights documents that were about social and economic rights, and that are like accepted and implemented by the majority of states right now. So the UN, for example, provided these charters and the documents. Then we have lots of European institutions. I'm not talking only about European Commission and European Union institutions, but also like Council of Europe that includes non-European Union countries, and they also provide lots of, documents that try to make, people feel involved, or at least grant them rights, freedoms, opportunities, as well as provide the responsibility for them. There are also lots of organizations in the Asian region, like few countries, or like, for example, Islamic countries, the Islamic Conference Organization, ASEAN, Americas, that I don't remember the name of it in English, but yeah, exactly. So there are tons of international organizations that are already doing this on governmental level. And, and they show their effectiveness. So why do you think they should be, put aside?
No. I mean, I'm not saying they should be put aside, but I would question their effectiveness, really. If you look at global trends, for instance, in terms of inequality, right? The OECD has been addressing the problem of tax evasion for 2 decades, and I would argue that the output is not sufficient and not efficient, right? I mean, gladly, we do have these organizations that are dealing with these subjects, but also the question is in how far are citizens involved in such decisions that affect them, or inaction that does affect them too, right? And I think that if we were to strengthen the UN or a global organization, at the same time, it needs to be made more democratic and accountable. And then we come to this idea of a global parliament and actually world law that would have a universal application. But of course, world law, then this is the process I've been talking about, would have to be really based on democratic legitimacy that today does not exist.
Right.
And I mean, I still would argue that the UN, I mean, it's doing, if it wasn't in existence today, it should have, it should be established. But it is not delivering what it is supposed to be delivering.
Okay,
right?
but if to mention non-governmental organizations, because there are like lots of them established for and based on different principles and for different purposes, and many of them are how do you call it? The UN, for example, get some kind of consulting, advisors,
exactly, yes, in many ways.
So and they're pretty influential. They can be very pushy in different regions of the world. So why do you think these organizations are already, like existing NGOs are not enough for providing the purposes, the global parliament or the global citizenship or the concept that democracy without the borders try to provide?
Well, I mean, let's be more specific and touch on some example really to illustrate better the problem. And let's pick the issue of carbon emissions that are known to cause, human-made global warming, and in consequence, climate change, in consequence, threatening the livelihoods of billions, maybe even of human civilization as a whole. We don't know. It depends on the temperature increase and many variables in terms of the planetary boundaries that are affected. So the UN and the intergovernmental system has been working on this for 30 years and has known the problem for even longer. But the output is that carbon emissions are still rising. And there was this limit of 1.5 degrees determined at the Paris Agreement conference, at the Paris conference. But it is, scientists tell us that we will likely, go beyond that limit and with unforeseen consequences. So of course, NGOs, the UN and others, they are trying hard to regulate this, but it's impossible. And there's, treaties, they are voluntary. Countries can actually, at their own discretion, determine their national contribution to carbon emission decrease. But where are we, right? So I think this is an important example. Or let's pick the other problem of nuclear proliferation or nuclear disarmament. There has been a duty under international law and the Non-Proliferation Treaty that nuclear powers would have to disarm, right, in a credible way and actually negotiate this. But what has happened, So I think that's one more example that is actually threatening. I mean, nuclear weapons are threatening the survival of humanity. NGOs, the UN, nobody can do anything about it. So I think, and I think that's the point. If we move towards a global system that is democratic everywhere, and that is one of the preconditions. Unfortunately, that is the case. I mean, we have to openly face this issue, right? But only then, I believe, we can build up a working system of collective security that allows countries to trust into each other and to actually disarm. And that doesn't only extend to nuclear arms, but also conventional arms.
Well, okay, just let's imagine that we have world consisting only of democratic countries. But in already existing democratic countries, there are people who don't believe, for example, in global warming, who believe in conspiracy theories about vaccination, about lots of other things, who, think that abortion or LGBTQ plus community is something against the God, etc., etc. What I mean is that they're not wrong or right. They just have different views on the issues that you and me, for example, and our viewers believe as like essential, as obvious. But they have completely opposite opinion on that. And that happens in the Netherlands, in the United States, in Sweden, in Italy, countries that are considered to be democratic, with lots of procedures that you have to follow to make the democracy work. So how are you going to make all these global citizens or these global institutions to have the same view on the issues that they're meant to work with, that they're meant to, decide on to make the planet better, for example?
Oh yeah, I mean, of course, different views will persist in global society. There's no question about this. And you've been naming the extreme, margins in this regard. And I think this post-truth, let's call it that way, or post-rational phenomenon is really, I believe, tied to insecurity that is connected to the process of modernization, value change. And I think that if there was a more effective global system, managing, for instance, macroeconomic policy, managing environmental change also, and giving people a voice, after all, which many feel they don't have, especially with regard to global institutions, I guess it is part of the puzzle piece that can address the problem. But I don't think that opinions will be homogeneous. Quite the contrary. I think a global parliament has also the purpose to reflect public opinion better than the UN can, because it's only intergovernmental. But that doesn't mean that public opinion is always the same. And one important point that needs mentioning also is that in this global parliament, as we envision it, countries wouldn't even exist, which also addresses the question of inclusion and representation, because there wouldn't be, one group of representatives from India voting always the same, but different parties from the country would ally with different parties from other countries in transnational groups.
Correct. But
right?
how can we be guaranteed that even in democratic country they won't be pushed to vote in favor of their country's interests, for example?
Yeah, well, there would be. I mean, that is actually a precondition that we in our advocacy have identified, that if a UN Parliamentary Assembly, as a first step, is not based on transnational groups, then it's an assembly we don't actually want and need. It's really about the transnational character. And I'm mentioning it because you would have different ideologies of members, right?
Right.
So I guess we would have a conservative group, a socialist group, a green group, who do have nuances, of course, or even big differences in their approach to global problems and how those should be addressed. So I think it's exactly the case that we would have different views, but then majority decision-making, qualified majorities. So other than at the UN, there would be a system that actually would be more effective, because decisions could be made, and those decisions, I mean, at least with regard to the vision that we have in long term, those decisions would actually be, enforceable. Okay. And implemented.
Well, you mentioned like different groups. You described this global parliament, and I had a very, very obvious reference to, for example, European Parliament. They have these, global groups from different parliamentary members from different countries that are unified by similar views or ideas or, rights, freedoms, whatever, ideologies. But as we can see, even in the European Union, this body is not something that makes, the main decisions. So it's more like recommendations, and these recommendations are not always followed by not only the members of the European Union, but even European Commission. So how, comparing to these already existing parliament, you can be sure that your global parliament will work and will force, global citizens, even its members, to follow its own decisions? Well,
I mean, I have to admit there are, of course, because you are saying, how can we be sure it works? There are imponderabilities. We cannot 100% be sure that it's going to work the way we envision it, for sure. There will be corrupt representatives in the global parliament because we are not changing human nature, right? Human nature remains the same, but we are trying to build institutions with checks and balances and accountability that help us manage global problems better. But the main issues of the human nature will stay the same, lobbyism, you know, and whatever. So that is true. But I would also say that the characterization of the European Parliament at this point, I think, is not exactly right. I think the European Parliament is a powerhouse now that has more legislative impact than many national parliaments, actually. Of course, what's still missing is the right to initiative. The European Parliament cannot initiate European regulation, and that is a problem. But it is indeed rightfully, you know, the best example that we have for this dynamics of transnational groups, right? Because in fact, we do have the different groups in the Parliament. But it's still a long way to go, for sure. You know, so it has developed over decades in the process of European integration, and that's not yet finished. So I would say in the global realm, we don't have as much time, actually. You know, so the European Parliament and European integration to the Lisbon Treaty, it took like 40 years. We don't have as much time globally. That is a problem I see. But then on the other hand, I guess the global revolution cannot come from one day to the next. It will have to be a slow process as well. And the sooner it starts, the better.
How to make this process even to be started, for example, is now we have a war in Europe, and we have, for example, Russia that tries to defend itself from any involvement from unfriendly countries, who denies the common human rights values and tells that it has its own values. It protects traditional, so-called traditional values based on Christianity or like other traditional religions, etc., etc. How do you expect this process, as you mentioned, to be started? Because what I, for example, see that it goes all the way back, that countries try to be as distant as possible, the cooperation doesn't work, and like if it doesn't work between the governments, how are you going to make the people from these countries who probably don't have even a vision or who are poisoned by propaganda or by total control of media, and I'm not talking only about Russia, that happens in many countries. So how do you expect them to cooperate with each other and becoming these global citizens?
The situation is very difficult, and it has obviously not improved in the recent years. You mentioned already nationalist populism, and there is a trend of autocratization, and globally democracies are under pressure. But I would look at this rather than an obstacle. I would look at this as a wake-up call, really, that democracies need to pull themselves together and do more in many respects. And one part of this is to do more that the UN, as the most universal global organization we have at this moment, despite all of its failures, that it becomes more democratic and that citizens have the ability to be heard there. And let me give you one example. But first, the first step that could be done is that the UN General Assembly establishes a parliamentary assembly. It could do that, right, according to the charter. And no charter change at the beginning would be necessary. So it's ironic, actually, that establishing a global parliament that is consultative in nature at first is easier than making only one single change in the Security Council, which is discussed so much, right? So if there was a majority in the General Assembly, this could be done. And the example I wanted to mention is that South Africa has been trying to remain kind of neutral with regard to the attack of Russia on Ukraine and the invasion for various reasons. But the interesting element here is that the opinion in South Africa, you know, is not necessarily unanimous. The opposition party Democratic Alliance, for instance, has a completely different view than the ANC government at this time of Ramaphosa. So in a UN Parliamentary Assembly, to be more precise, to use that term, the South African delegation would divide on that subject, right? So the ANC they would ally with some group, if they would be able to ally on that subject at all. And the Democratic Alliance representative would be able to say, well, the government is abstaining on these votes, but the Democratic Alliance, which also represents a legitimate portion of voters, is of the opinion that this is a breach of the UN Charter and the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. And, so I think that we would have different dynamics here in this parliamentary assembly. Even in this difficult situation, I think it would be helpful.
Right, but in the beginning of our discussion, you mentioned that the UN nowadays, it's not very effective organization. And my question is, why do you want to establish something based in UN or on UN? Why not to take more effective organization that has probably fewer members, but it can become, with these global parliament, global citizenship concept, more attractive for other countries to join? So why not to, for example, base it on OECD or maybe European structures or maybe Asian structures, because they are probably more effective in cooperating with each other? I don't know. Do you find any international organization to be more effective and to see these concepts to be implemented by that organization, not the UN?
Well, that would mean to establish a completely new organization in parallel to the UN. Such proposals do exist. So there are proposals to start a global parliament separate from any existing.
Once again, did I get it right that there is no international organization that is as effective that you could immediately mention it to establish this global thing? So
that's right.
If it's something else than UN, it should be new UN. It should be another.
Yeah, that's unfortunately true.
Yeah.
Sure. You could add a parliamentary assembly at all sorts of organizations like the OECD, and there are many of those, dozens already in existence, right? So. But I think the key is to look at it as a process. So we would establish it at the UN because the UN is the most universal and most recognized global organization that we have.
Correct.
Despite all its failures and problems, it's good that it exists, and it has a universal character. But we wouldn't stop here. The reason why I personally am still convinced of the utility and value of this parliamentary assembly is because I believe it can be an engine of change inside the UN, right? So with progressive parliamentarians and representatives in that assembly, I would hope that the reform of the UN could be pushed forward, even towards charter reform. But that wouldn't be a separate process, as I already mentioned. It would be a process that would have to necessarily be tied to a changing political environment. But I also think, Russia and China, they are extreme examples as they are moving towards, especially, China towards totalitarianism, in my opinion, right? And even Russia too. But we have many countries that are in transition. They are in a kind of transitional phase, and particularly vulnerable in their development of democracy. And I think that a parliamentary assembly that actually embodies the idea of democracy at the UN as no other body there could be a tool to help strengthen democratic forces, in particular in these countries of transition.
I know that you try to represent this idea of global citizenship and of global parliament and to many representatives of different countries, to many officials, diplomats, governmental persons. What do they say?
Well, most governments have no official position, so they would tell you their personal opinion, because there was no opinion making officially in their respective department. But my sense is that if we ask the diplomats, they are all agreed that the UN should simply stay as it is.
Okay.
Right? They don't embrace the idea.
No matter which country the diplomat is representing.
Yeah. If they were now on television, they might say something else. But behind closed doors in private conversations, it is really hard and an uphill battle, and that is actually worrying me most.
And why do you think it's like that? Why, for example, those democratic countries you appeal to don't support these ideas?
They are paying lip service to the idea of global democracy only. If it comes to actually changing the status quo at the UN. They don't want that because they think it makes their lives more complicated. But democracy is complicated.
But do you think they need it? Because they have their democracy. Maybe it sounds selfish, but I mean, like, they have the democracy, the working democracy. Why do they have to, you know, care of the entire world? They already do a lot of programs. They already invest a lot of money into supporting democracies, into doing some humanitarian things, which is not about democracy, but still. So why do they have to care more about, like, democratization of the world? They have the democracy, their own product, so like, why to?
I think that represents their view quite nicely. But of course, what's lacking here is the global perspective. What is in the best interest of humanity? And that's exactly the point.
Right.
That the diplomats, at least the career diplomats, you know, in the ministries and foreign offices, it is their duty, that's how they've been trained, it is their duty to look at the national interest. But that national interest is not enough to manage global problems. The lowest common denominator, for instance, at climate conferences, is not providing the output that is required, right? And that is actually the catch-22 situation we are in. And I think eventually there will be a situation where this idea, you know, that the mindset will change. And one element here is really that once high-level politicians realize that the people want this, right? They're voters. They will change their opinion from one day to the next.
Well, they're politicians.
Exactly.
Yeah, of course.
So, and that gives me hope, because if a mass movement, and there are many in the environmental area, for instance, if they pick this up, and I think eventually they will, because it is only a logical extension of the idea of you know, system change instead of climate change. What we need to change is really the global governance system.
So did I get it right that the more people get enlightened about these global citizenship concept, the more welcoming the governments could be? Of
course, in democracies.
Okay.
Autocracies will not care in a bit.
Oh, well, but at least democracies, because now we realize that even democratic governments in democratic countries are not much interested in.
They are not interested in it. But I think that once they realize voters are interested in it, they will quickly embrace this.
So enlightenment is a key here.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. My last question: when, at least in post-communist countries, when something like democracy or citizenship or parliamentary structures are mentioned, people used to think about like rights and freedoms, only rights and freedoms. But you also mentioned that there should be and there will be responsibilities, the global rights, but also global responsibilities. What are these global responsibilities and how crucial they are for the concept of the global citizenship? Is it only about rights, freedoms, respect, or it's also about being responsible, and if yes, for what?
Well, I think that the responsibilities, first of all, are of an abstract, symbolic nature, which means a responsibility to engage in keeping the global environment healthy, right? But also responsibilities then that extend to global corporations, and that would then have to be more specified through actual legal rules, right? But the point is that such rules then would make citizens responsible without intermediation of nation states, right? So that is important. I mean, one key civic responsibility, I guess, in a state is to pay your taxes, right? I mean, it's an abstract, but that's one of the responsibilities. And I guess in a federal global system that we will have global and will have to need global taxation in order to control multinational corporations better, for instance. And then it would be their responsibility to pay these taxes, right? And I mean, that would be enforceable. So that's why I'm saying it's a symbolic, abstract element, first of all.
Okay. Thank you very much. And let's hope that this global parliamentary structure will, soon, come to exist.
Thank you.
Thank you.